Hello folks, this time around we are doing a beach watercolor landscape. We're of course going to start with a nice clean piece of paper and starting with the background. Remember with watercolors you want to start from the back to the front, and I'm going to do a gradation background for my sky, and I'm going to go from red to orange to yellow. Now when I do this, my red is going to look very faint. This of course is because it's very watered down. You want to do a gradation and going all the way across the page, not stopping, because then you're going to have brush marks. And you don't want paintbrush marks, you want everything to look very gradual and well mixed together. Doing this while your paper is wet is going to allow for a higher success rate. I'm getting some yellow in there, and I want my color to be a little bit more vivid and strong at the bottom, so I'm using a little less water. Okay, I'm gonna let this sit for a second as I clean off my brush, and then I'll go in and add some clouds and a sun. Easy trick to add a sun, wrapping a paper towel around a glue stick, and I have a perfect circle of really clear, nice sun, and all I had to do there was use the paper towel to take away the color. I'm gonna let my paper dry a little bit, and then I'm going to go back in and create some stratus clouds. I'm doing this with a flat paintbrush. It's a little bit wet, but very minimal amounts. It's just enough to get my paintbrush wet so I can go in and draw in almost these stratus clouds. So these are the streaky clouds that you see in the sky, and all I'm doing right now is going in with a clean paintbrush, and I'm using the slight bit of water that is on the paintbrush and dragging it across and essentially drawing in where I want my clouds to be. This is a very easy, quick way to make some dynamic clouds in my sky. Perfect. Looking good. I let that dry, and I'm ready to rock and roll into my sea. So I'm going in, creating my horizon line. That of course is where the land, or in this case the sea, meets the sky. And I'm not only using blue, I've mixed a little bit of green in there, and you could potentially do purple, but just keep in mind that the sea has a lot of different colors involved with it. Some areas may be darker, so using less water, and some areas may be lighter. You can see that I'm fading it down, so just bringing my watercolor down on the page a little bit more. I'm not going to have a perfectly straight line in the sand, because generally that doesn't happen, and having a slight angle instead is going to allow me for a little bit more visually interesting landscape, which is always the goal. I let that dry completely, and I'm going to add in some rocks along with some sand. My sand's going to be relatively faint, so I have very watered down brown here, and I'm using a round brush at the moment, relatively small detail brush. You'll notice that I have some different values, so lighter and darker areas, because that's what happens when sand gets wet. Some areas are darker, some areas are lighter. Let that dry completely, and then I'm going back in and I'm going to work on some of those rocks to just add a little bit more happening inside my landscape here. Now these natural formations are not just peaks. They're not going to be perfect little triangles, so make sure you have some jagged marks and are filling it in from there. It's always good to test your color before you go directly onto your page, whether that means it's in a sketchbook or a different piece of paper, or simply on the palette like you can see me doing on the screen. That's really up to you, but testing a color before you go onto your final page is always a good idea. Right now I'm just filling in that shape that I had previously created. and then I'll be going back in, layering some different values to create some highlighted areas along with some deep, deep dark browns. That's going to allow my rock formation to look more like rocks and have that jagged look, because you want it to look as natural as possible, because this could potentially be an area where waves are crashing against it, so there might be some erosion as I'm working. Since I did layer on top of my sea, it's going to be very important that by the time I finish, I cannot see my ocean or my sea through the rocks. So everything needs to be nice and opaque, not transparent. As I continue, I'm just building in some darker values here and getting my rocks to look a little bit more similar to how I want them to look in the end. This might take me a little bit. There's no problem with layering and reworking and editing. I'm going to have a little bigger mountain here or rock formation in the background because I just feel like there's not enough going on in my beach watercolor landscape at the moment. And maybe your beach is different than mine. Maybe you have palm trees. It is entirely up to you, but I'm just going to add in another fainter rock formation behind the ones that I currently have. You can see I let that dry, and then I'm going to go back in and add a few more darker values. Some parts of my rock formation are still a little bit transparent, and I want to get them to the point where that's no longer the case. And I want to have some highlighted areas and a little bit more defined lines. So being able to go in with that small round detail brush is allowing me to be successful in that regard. You'll notice that I'm mixing some of my browns and blacks together to achieve that really, really dark value. Don't forget to include highlights as you work, and those will really show up once you let your paper dry and you can see where your highlighted areas are and those super, super dark values that you're able to create in the process. I'm going to go in once more, add a little bit more darkness in here, and maybe do more of a medium tone so I'm not quite so super, super dark and super, super light within my rock formation. Always remember that in art you can create your own images, but it's also good to look at a reference point, whether that's online or in real life, and that's going to help guide you and make things look more realistic as you're working. As I continue on, it's very similar to what it was before. I'm just making sure I get my little mountainous area rock formation as happy with it as I want to, because this is going to be my last area. Not that you can't go back and work on things. You always do have that availability and option when it comes to art, because art is never finished, only abandoned. But in my situation, I'm getting pretty close to the point where I am ready to rock and roll. I'm going to add a little bit with values and some darker areas, some details within the sand and in that foreground, and then I'll be close to done here. Don't forget to add in a little shadow underneath where your rock formation is if you're following along with me or doing something similar. You don't want it to be totally floating. It doesn't need to be super dark, especially since this is a beach landscape, but you should have a little bit of something. Now what I'm going to do is really clean off my brush, make sure it's at a nice point, and I'm going to add in a couple darker areas in my sand. So I have very little water on my paintbrush at the moment and very little color, so I'm just barely touching my page and gently plotting these in. And these little details just add for a little bit more depth and hint at where I have my sea. Maybe it's footprints in the sand, maybe they're rocks, little bitty rocks, especially in comparison to our formation. But all those little details, anything extra you add, just adds some visual interest and helps improve the piece. So always good things. Notice that I use that darker brown and not just pure black, which allows it to be a little bit more warm. And I'm pretty close to done here. If you're following along, hope it went well.